predecessor, Earl Warren.
Floyd Abrams, there would not be a Pentagon Papers case without Daniel Ellsberg. Who was he?
Daniel Ellsberg had been a Marine in the war in Vietnam. He was an intellectual. He had favored the war in its early days and had come to believe that it was a war crime. He had come to believe that we were doing things in Vietnam which violated international law and principles of morality and the like. He was one of the authors of the Pentagon Papers. He was a scholar as well as everything else I've said. And so he was one of the authors commissioned to write chapters of the Pentagon Papers. He came to the view that if only the public could see the degree to which it had been lied to through the years, which perpetuated American presence in Vietnam, that they would demand that the war end. He felt, notwithstanding our victory and notwithstanding everything else that happened, and he feels today that he failed, that his motive for releasing this information, for risking jail to himself for a very long time, was to end the war. And while the publication was very newsworthy and it affected public opinion, it did not do that.
We have said that this is a very accelerated case, and some of the cases in the series have taken years to get to Supreme Court. Not so in this instance. Let me walk you through this very quick timeline that this case was under. Just a bit prior to the June 13th, 1971 publication of the first story, the newspaper had gotten the material from Daniel Ellsberg. By June 15th, the Times received its cease and desist order. The government seeks a restraining order. Then June 18th, the Washington Post published its first story on the Pentagon Papers. By June 19th, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the injunction. On June 22nd, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals hears cases and grants the injunction. I don't think that's correct. There was two different courts in this. On June 25th, Supreme Court takes up the case. The oral arguments were heard on June 26th. Here's another interesting thing we'll talk about later. On June 29th, the United States Senator from Alaska, Mike Gravel, entered the papers into the Senate record through his subcommittee, and the court announced a decision by June 30th. So very rapid discussion in the legal system of this case, and we'll learn about the implications of that as we go forward. First bit of video, we're going to introduce you to Hedrick Smith. He was a longtime New York Times reporter and happened to be one of the New York Times reporters that was writing this story. He talked to us very recently, and he told us how the New York Times got the information and how the paper conducted its work to publish that first story.
I first saw the papers in the Hilton Hotel on 6th Avenue in New York. Sheehan had gotten a hotel room there up in about the 35th floor. We had two file cabinets that were absolutely full of papers. So we're talking about 4 drawers, 8 drawers of papers. I mean, tens of thousands of pages of documents. We just started to go through them. Sheehan had just begun looking at them by the time I got there. And it was just amazing to see the amount of material and to look at one document after another, top secret, top secret, top secret, eyes only, which means only the president can see it, or the Secretary of State, or the ambassador, or the commander, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whatever. And we started to go pouring through them to try to figure out how to do stories about it. I mean, there was so much material, it was almost impossible to figure out how to handle it journalistically. What we did was we simply followed the organization of the Pentagon Papers. We took 13 chapters and spread them out and basically dealt with them in that way. I think in the end we came out with 12 or 13 different days on which we ran the papers. The government's argument was that publishing the papers would harm national security. We looked at it. This was history. All these events were over. We're talking about the Eisenhower years, the 1950s, the Kennedy years, the 1960s. And then the Johnson years, the late 1960s. And here we are in 1971. There was only one part of the Pentagon Papers that was live in the sense that events were still unfolding. And that was what was called the diplomatic annex. It was all about the various different efforts and peace channels there were to negotiate some kind of settlement between Washington and Hanoi. We never touched that. We took one look at that. We said, if we write about that, we have no idea whether or not those channels are still alive. We could harm diplomacy. We're not going to go into that. So we were mindful of actual national security needs.
And let me show you the headline that came out of that work. It was June 13th, 1971. Vietnam Archive Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement. Neil Sheehan had the byline for that story.